Security advisor comes 1 week after President Trump asked his first advisor, General Michael Flynn, to submit his resignation. Despite that announcement today, many questions remain about Flynn's ties to Russia. Meanwhile, Vice President Pence trying to calm the waters overseas, telling European allies not to worry.
Be assured, the United States as well will continue to hold Russia accountable, even as we search for new common ground, which President Trump firmly believes can be found.
Now, all of this coming as NBC's Bill Neely reports a jaw-dropper, and that is that the Kremlin is compiling a psychological dossier on Trump, and he's doing that for Putin. Now, here's the former Russian deputy foreign minister.
7 pages describing psychological portrait of Trump, especially based on this last 2-3 months.
The Kremlin experts believe Mr. Trump can be naive.
He doesn't understand fully who is Mr. Putin. He's a tough guy.
And relies on his intuition more than his advisors.
He should listen to the people, especially in the areas where he's weak.
Malcolm Nance, who spent more than 3 decades in naval intelligence, special operations, and homeland security, and author of The Plot to Hack America, How Putin's Cyber Spies and WikiLeaks Tried to Steal the 2016 Election. Ed Rendell is the former Democratic governor of the great state of Pennsylvania, and Ken Vogel is chief investigative reporter for Politico. Let me go first to you, Malcolm. I mean, the news about preparing a dossier, a psychological profile on the president for Putin, while that seems, quite explosive, I suspect that is done routinely by Putin and even by our government on world leaders. Am I right or wrong?
No, you're absolutely correct. Creating a psychological profile and a leadership dossier and fundamental information about a statesman of another nation is very common. I find this rather suspicious, and I find a lot of things the Russians do rather suspicious. Donald Trump, with his foreign policy so absolutely close to Russia, there probably was one of these done by Russian intelligence, FSB, and their covert organization, the SVR, some time ago. And I find it very interesting that they're now framing this as a document where they have wanted to reframe Donald Trump over the last 3 months and then announced it publicly. That's sort of a message that's being sent out to Donald Trump, to them, that they're watching him carefully. And I don't know how that plays.
Governor, what are your thoughts on this, whatever this relationship is between Trump and Russia, the United States and Russia? I mean, it seems, frankly, I'm not sure we have all the facts in either direction or what's exaggerated and what's not. But nonetheless, it certainly is a lot that's being discussed about it.
Well, Greta, I think you said the operative words. We don't have all the facts, and until we do, it's hard to figure out what's happening here. I think they may have overplayed their hand a little bit. This love affair with Putin and Trump may force Donald Trump, especially with the investigations going on about whether there was contact during the campaign, may force Donald Trump to keep those sanctions in place. Because right now, if he were to lift the sanctions against Russia, I think all hell would break loose. So I think either Trump overplayed his hand or the Russians overplayed their hand. But I think it's going to be very difficult in this current political environment for them to lift the sanctions.
Governor, have any sense of how much these sanctions pinch the Russian government, pinch Putin? I mean, do they have, I mean, what impact they have?
I think they hurt the Russian economy, and right now, that's Putin's Achilles heel. Unless the Russian economy improves markedly and fairly quickly, I think Putin could find himself in a little bit of trouble. So that's an important factor. They really want these sanctions to be lifted, and I don't see how Donald Trump can do it. He didn't want to fire Flynn, but when it became public, he had no problem firing Flynn because, in the end, he is a politician. So the politician looks at this and says, if you lift these sanctions, all hell's going to break loose. I'm not sure they can do it.
Ken, can you give us any more sort of facts from your investigative reporting on this whole Russia Trump campaign, Trump colleagues, and any idea, any more information on this relationship?
Yeah, I will tell you, per the Governor Rendell's analysis of whether Trump would be hard-pressed to lift these sanctions, clearly, I think we've seen him take a more traditional approach, an approach that is sort of more in keeping with traditional American foreign policy towards Russia and towards the sanctions. We reported that that, in fact, he met on the sidelines of the National Prayer Breakfast a few weeks ago with this Ukrainian politician, former President Tymoshenko, who's likely presidential candidate again, and assured her that they would not be lifting the sanctions. So I think we see some pressure there. We obviously also see Mike Pence in Europe right now assuring these European leaders that he is with them. Well, being with them and being with NATO means being for the sanctions and in some ways being more aggressive to Russia than what we have seen from Donald Trump.
Malcolm, when the sanctions were first imposed, when the 35 or so were tossed out of the country, the Russian diplomats by President Obama in late December, there was no reaction or no response or no retaliation by Putin and Russia. Now the sanctions have not been lifted. We have a new president. What are they going to do? Just sit and sort of take the sanctions, or do you expect them to respond in some way?
No, I think for now, I think they placed their bets on Donald Trump. I mean, they've been supporting Trump since the beginning. And certainly now that we know that General Flynn did have communications with the Russians on that very same day, may have assured them about the situation with sanctions and asked them to hold their fire, especially since they weren't just kicking out 35 diplomats. They were 35 intelligence collectors who were doing signals intelligence and cyber warfare in the United States. So it's not as innocent as it seems. But on the face of that, Donald Trump is going to be pressured right now. He's being pressured from the right to keep these sanctions. And if they had that conversation with Ms. Tymoshenko and have assured the Ukraine, it's going to be very hard for him to squirm out of this. And perhaps that's the reason why Russia is releasing a psychological profile on Trump so publicly, in order to give him a little pressure.
Governor, I hate to ask a question about politics on such an important topic as Russia, because when it comes to foreign policy, we sort of try to shed the political ramification, try to do what's right and not sort of what's personally right. But do you have any sort of thoughts on how this plays out politically, at least here in Washington, and how the Democrats and Republicans are going to play this one?
Well, in terms of the sanctions, again, I think if he lifted the sanctions, and don't put it past him, I mean, you know, he says one thing and then does another thing. We've seen that already in the first month. But if he lifted the sanctions, I think he'd get political incoming from both the Democrats and the Republicans. I think it's almost an untenable position for him to take. And they may have outsmarted himself. So it's interesting. Did Russia release the fact that they're doing this profile to make it seem like they're not so buddy-buddy with Trump? Are they going to do some things now to make it seem like they're not so buddy-buddy, so that if he did lift the sanctions, people wouldn't think there was anything nefarious about it? I wouldn't put it past the Russians. But politically, lifting the sanctions is almost a non-starter.
General Scales, I sort of get the idea of, of the politics and listening to Governor Rendell, the sort of the political viewpoint on this here in Washington. What about the Pentagon or the military viewpoint of Russia?
Well, I think what's not news here is that the Russians are compiling a dossier on American leaders. I mean, they do that all the time, and I might add, going back to World War II, we do the same thing on our potential enemies, and it's very important that we do it. The news here is that the Russians leaked the fact that they were compiling the dossier on President Trump. That's the news, and all it is, it's part of the greater Russian information warfare campaign that they're conducting against us virtually every day. They think they own the information high ground here. They think they're better at it than we are. And the idea that they're leaking a dossier is just the first step of a continuing information campaign that they will continue against this administration, no matter how President Trump reacts to the sanctions.
Ken, I agree with the general.
Okay, go ahead.
I agree with the general, although I would say that this will be the most unique psychological profile they've ever assembled.
Well, that probably is indeed true. Ken, I'm going to talk about the possibility of an investigation, or there are ongoing investigations already into this sort of connection to the 2016 election. Do you see the Trump administration the least bit alarmed or worried or concerned about this investigation, or do they see it just as something that's annoying?
I mean, they're putting up a really good face. If they are alarmed, we don't see any evidence of that. In fact, you heard Reince Priebus suggesting that everyone in the administration was cleared. That doesn't really get to the question, which is whether Trump's associates during the campaign were, in fact, in communications with the Russians. And some of our reporting about Paul Manafort, one-time campaign chairman for Donald Trump's associations in Ukraine and in Russia.
Anything wrong. There's one thing to have an association with something, there's another thing to do something wrong.
Absolutely. And that, right, I don't think it would be hard for me, knowing what the reporting that I have done on this, to be able to expect that there would be any kind of smoking gun on this. And then to take it even further, if there were a smoking gun, to what end? You know, this idea that somehow the hacking of John Podesta's email or the DNC server somehow tipped the election, I think is wrong-headed and oversimplified.
We still don't want the Russians messing with our election in any form, even if it doesn't tip the election. Gentlemen, thank you all.